and thank you for joining the Superior Health Quality Alliance Nursing Home Leadership Roundtable, where we plan to continue our series, Turning Your Deficiencies into Efficiencies. Today is all about F0607, F0609, failure to report suspected abuse or neglect. My name is Constance Tetrov, and I am a Quality Improvement Advisor with Superior Health Quality Alliance, and I am accompanied by several of my other colleagues, Tabitha, Margaret, and Mykesha. Miss Mykesha will be monitoring the chat and providing you with any of the links, as well as we have our guest speaker here, Miss Jana Broughton. We host these 1-hour sessions on the second and fourth Wednesday of the month. The first half is a didactic presentation. Then the remaining time will be for questions and answers. The presentation link has been dropped into the chat and will be repeatedly dropped into the chat. And you can feel free to use the chat box to share any comments, questions, and even resources during the presentation. Besides learning from our speakers, we learn from each other and our peers. Towards the end of today's event, we will also put an evaluation link in the chat that will only take you 1 to 2 minutes to complete. Use your evaluations to help us give you a better experience. Please help me in welcoming all of our guests, and we look forward to sharing your knowledge and your experience with you. The floor is all yours, Miss Jana.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Constance. Thank you, Mykesha. I'm Jana Broughton, and I'm a Quality Improvement Advisor here with Superior Health Quality Alliance. Before I became a Quality Improvement Advisor, my backstory, just to share, because I have such empathy about this topic. I spent 30 years plus working in long-term care, starting as a social worker, and then became a nursing home administrator. And during my tenure as a nursing home administrator, I think this was probably one of the biggest struggles, the failure to report, the reporting of abuse and neglect, having staff understand when to report. So as we dive into this today, I really hope that this conversation is a conversation. It is truly not to be one-sided where I'm presenting, because by no means will I share with you that I am the expert on this. This is a very gray space, and it's open to a lot of interpretation, regardless of how the regulations are read in the State Operations Manual Appendix PP. So I'm going to share my slides and I'm going to jump into this topic. If at any point in time you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And Mykesha, Constance, please feel free to interrupt me when I take a pause and just let me know what the question is. Again, this is meant to be interactive and conversational around this topic because it's an important topic that I think we all need additional understanding on. So, all right. So you should be able to see my screen. Is everybody able to see it? Wonderful. All right, so we're going to jump in. So the objectives for today really is to understand the educational requirements for all staff regarding reporting of abuse or neglect. I think this is the foundational piece, and we're going to talk more about that as I go through my slides. Knowing where to find the regulatory language regarding abuse and neglect requirements and what is reportable to state agencies. And then finally, understanding how to investigate and responding to an abuse or neglect allegation. So to start with, I did include the preemptive F tags. For those of you that are not familiar necessarily with the State Operations Manual, here is the link down below. This is the State Operations Manual Appendix PP, where all of the F tag rules and regulations for nursing homes are found. And when we talk about F607 and F609, there is a whole series of other F tags that they build upon, and those are 600, 602, 603, 604, and 605. And in summary, those are the definitions of what constitutes abuse, neglect, and misappropriation. It provides the definition of what freedom from abuse is, and it gives us the groundworks of residents' rights and the resident rights responsibilities of nursing homes. A few things to point out to the audience is that I encourage you to review the SOM on a regular basis or routine basis and look for updates. You may not necessarily get notified that there have been updates in language or nuances around the F tags when they are published. However, if you go into the SOM Appendix PP, the language that is updated is usually highlighted in red, and you can find them by the F tag. You can go through and see what has been struck out, what has been changed, or definitions have been updated. So under the F tags in the 600 series, there are updated definitions. For example, resident-to-resident altercations has been more defined in the past 18 months. Highlighted facility responsibility to evaluate the capacity for consent around sexual abuse has been defined, and additional language has been added. And that includes the inclusion of the reasonable person philosophy or theory, meaning what would a reasonable person think or respond to a situation or an event. And then the psychological harm scale was added as a resource in the past 2 years. So for F607, this is the F tag that we see probably cited the most across the country when it comes to the abuse F tags. And that is that the facility must develop and implement written policies and procedures that prohibit and prevent abuse, neglect, exploitation of residents, and misappropriation of resident property. There is a lot packed into that statement, okay? So when we talk about prohibit and prevent abuse, excuse me, with policies, it talks about establishing policies and procedures to investigate any such allegations, and it includes the training as required for the prohibition and prevention of abuse. Also establishes the coordination with the QA/PI program, and those are the rules right there, the link to the numbers of the rules where that is found. So F607, really in a nutshell, talks about developing and implementing written policies and procedures. And in your policies and procedures for abuse and neglect, I encourage you to pull your policies and procedures out and reread them, write on them, talk about them, think about are you meeting the spirit of the psalm in your policies and procedures? And when was the last time that you looked at those and updated them to make sure they mirror the language in Appendix PP with the recent updates? For example, the misappropriation of resident property. When you define that in your policies and your procedures, do you include misappropriation of resident medication? One of the number one exploding citations that we're finding, when you go out and you look at 2567s and you read them, it's missing narcotic medication or narcotic patches or pain medications or anxiolytics, like Xanax, for example, that has been perhaps missing from a resident's med card, and the facility failed to do a proper investigation or even report it to the proper authorities. Or it's not in your policy and procedures to address missing medications, for example. So under F607, it talks about the development and implementation. And the implementation word, implement, means action, and taking action on your process for prevention and prohibition of abuse. And it's an all-encompassing F tag. So under F607, it also requires facilities to ensure that crimes are reported if they occur in a federally funded long-term care facility. And the policies and procedures also must include posting a conspicuous notice of employee rights that includes prohibiting and prevention of the retaliation for reporting abuse and neglect. I have discovered in getting ready for this presentation, a few 2567s where facilities had not posted this notice for employees and an employee felt retaliated against, and it was in an IJ level. So not in our region, thank goodness, but making sure that your staff understand where to see the posting, and that if they report to the state survey agency, to a law enforcement agency of something that they feel met the threshold of abuse or neglect, you cannot retaliate against them for that reporting. There cannot be any actions or linkage to the reporting of a suspected crime to actions taken to a staff member. And I think that's really important for us to not only be aware of, but also to be providing education to staff and making sure that that notice is in a conspicuous location. And how is that interpreted? Well, conspicuous location means that an opportunity or a location that a majority of your staff would recognize a place to go find information or be notified of information. So where are your notices published? Are they on, a break room wall that very few people see? Are they by a time clock that is no longer used because people punch in and out on their phones? Or are they in an area that staff routinely walk by, see, or seek out for information, where you've educated your staff to go to for updates of information or postings on the rules, policies, or procedures of the facility? So here's some things to consider regarding F607. Look at your policy and review the elements. Does it contain mirrored language? Meaning, does the language of your policy match the language of the state operations manual? Are the actions actionable? Do they meet the threshold of providing some type of action or responsibility of enacting F607, meaning your processes? They state out very clearly that if I were to pick your policy up as a new employee, I would understand what the process is for reporting suspected abuse or misappropriation. And then this next one is something that I encourage facilities to do, and that is to conduct an audit to ensure education and training is up to date regarding the abuse policy and requirements. When is the last time that you sat down as an administrator or with your human resources person, whoever responsibility for keeping staff education up to date, and looked at your education on abuse and neglect and on your policies and procedures, including the language around retaliation, to make sure that your staff have been educated and do they understand? Is there comprehension around that responsibility? Or was the education conducted in such a way that it was basically a read and sign, and you have no way of knowing the comprehension of the language of the policy and procedure? And why is that important? Well, we're going to get to why it's important for your staff to understand their responsibilities around abuse when we talk about the next F tag. And then finally, under F607, and this is a very hot topic because we have a lot of facilities that are using contracted temporary agency staff. And have you ever validated the staff that you're bringing in, agency contracted, volunteers, students? Do you know if they've been trained to your policies and procedures regarding abuse? Do you know if they know how to report suspected abuse and neglect in your facility? And what to do if they suspect abuse or neglect or misappropriation or a crime has been committed? So those are some audits that I encourage facilities to consider. For number 3, specifically, when you're hiring people through an agency, through contract, through a temporary app, I know that there's a lot of shift work that can be done just directly with people. What's your process to make sure that new people coming in to work or provide care or services to your residents have been educated or trained on your policies and processes? And I think this is probably the most important piece that you would provide training to a temporary employee on first and foremost. Where do they go if they see something, hear something, suspect something, and how do they report it? And who do they report it to? So I have a quick question. I want you to drop into the chat. Does your facility have a best practice for educating and training of agency, temporary staff, volunteers, or students? And if so, what is that practice? I'd love to hear from it because this is a sharing environment and we want to learn from one another. So how do you tackle this really difficult topic? Because people come and go. Maybe they work one shift in your building and they go down the street and work a shift for somebody else. So anybody have any suggestions or best practices around this? And Keisha, Constance, anything in the chat yet?
No, not yet.
Yeah.
I know that in one of the organizations and as a consultant, I would always encourage the facility to have a agency binder to allow them to know the most important things, where to find things, where the codes are, and have them come early so that they can review that binder, they can get that information, and then they can get a little orientated before they start their shift, of course.
That's a great practice. I know many facilities, when I ask this question about That compliance information is submitted within the hiring process, meets them at the door. Yes, those are, you have to, right? You have to have that stuff done before they come in and take care of your residents. The mini orientation with competencies, wow, that is a best practice. So thanks, guys, because that is really, this is the opportunity to talk about how do you handle this? Agency is everywhere. It's really rare that I talk to a facility or that any of us talk to a facility and they're not using some type of contingent or temporary staffing in today's environment out there in the workforce. It's a reality. And knowing that that's the reality, I think is, part of the problem, right? We know it's the reality. So how do we deal with it? And a binder, meeting them at the door, having a process where if you're dealing with one or two agencies, making sure that that agency is responsible to do that education and training, and that their staff have been provided your policies and processes on multiple topics, but predominantly abuse and neglect is probably the most important before they start the day with your building. All right. So I'm going to give you, these are some recent F600 citations from our region. It is cited on 43% of all surveys in the Chicago Centers for Medicare and Medicare or CMS region, and that's our region. And in looking at the F600 tags, many homes are tagged more than once in a 12-month period. The most I found was four times in a 12-month period, and that was for both recertification surveys and complaint surveys. Actual harm and higher tags are decreasing, which is good news, while non-harm tags are increasing across the region. And 600 is still tagged in tandem with F609 for occurrences of failure to report. So here's an example, resident demonstrating sexually inappropriate remarks, behavior of caregivers, and then initiates unwanted contact with another resident causing distress, and the victim had a BIM score of 4. So these are some examples, and we're going to talk about more examples about abuse and neglect. Making sure that we have those foundational pieces of education around what abuse and neglect is, what the types of abuse and neglect are, how to report abuse and neglect, who to report abuse and neglect to, and what constitutes reporting in our building. And finally, understanding that the reportability, the timeline for reporting is based upon when the incident was first identified, is when your timeline starts. Now, what I find, and we're going to talk more about this, but when looking at 2567s, predominantly the failure to report abuse had two parts of it. And the education part of it is overwhelming. Staff report that they didn't know that it met the threshold of reportability. They didn't recognize that it was an incident that should have been reported. They don't know what to report, how to report it, who to report it to. The basics of an abuse and neglect program or prevention of abuse and neglect program is that education piece for your staff. And I would encourage you as providers to not rely 100% of your education on this topic on an electronic medium where you're going in and having staff doing modules on abuse and neglect, because they are not comprehending and they're not retaining the information pertinent to your facility. What I would encourage you to do is to utilize your policy, your procedures, your actual examples of your facility to perform face-to-face education with your staff routinely and repetitively on situations. And then also make sure that staff, audit their comprehension and do a robust auditing program to make sure staff understand scenario-based examples of how to handle scenarios. And we're going to talk about some scenarios as we go through the presentation today, and some of those scenarios you could utilize for training with your staff. So F609 is the reporting of abuse. And it's the facility must develop and implement written policies. So you see how these tags overlap and build on each other. So this is the development and implementation of written policies and procedures that ensure reporting of crimes occur in federally funded long-term care facilities. Covered individuals are trained annually related to reporting requirements. And who is a covered individual? A covered individual is anyone who works in a federally funded long-term care facility, either as a paid employee, a contracted employee, a volunteer, or a one-time person coming in to provide some type of service to your residents. Covered individuals understand how to report suspicion to state agencies and at least one law enforcement entity. So your staff need to be trained at a minimum annually. And I use the staff term to cover all those individuals. So people in your facility providing care to your residents, that's the definition, that they're trained annually at a minimum related to reporting requirements and how to report suspicion to state agency and law enforcement agencies if they suspect that crime has occurred. So this is where a lot of facilities get hung up. It's the reporting immediately. And I highlighted that because I think the assumption sometimes is that we have up to 2 hours. And I would say to you that report it immediately, but not later than 2 hours of forming a suspicion of a crime if it causes serious bodily injury. Report within 24 hours non-harm criminal events. Complete investigation within 5 days and submit to proper state agencies. Those are your timelines. So reporting immediately, but not later than 2 hours of forming a suspicion of a crime. Where facilities get caught up is the failure to report timely. For example, staff member believes they've witnessed or observed a crime, but failed to report it until the next shift to the person responsible for your abuse program. That then gets reported to the state agency, and you may make the assumption that you're reporting it immediately. However, you're past your 2 hour threshold because the individual who was responsible for the observation or suspected or suspicion of that crime occurring did not report it to you timely to report it off to your state agency. This is where we see, and when you review 2567s on failure to report timely, where facilities are really struggling with this reporting timeline. Staff in your education, and that's how you get trained, it goes backwards to the F600 tags and move forward. When you're educating staff, your staff need to be educated on how to handle a suspicion after hours, weekends, holidays, or if the suspected individual is the person in charge working on that shift, how do you report above and beyond that? What is their responsibility to report? And unfortunately, when you think about abuse and neglect suspicions or abuse and neglect misappropriation, it rarely happens on a Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30 shift when the administrator and director of nursing are in the building. Rarely occurs. It's usually on an off shift, off hours, holiday or weekend, and you may have somebody that doesn't work in your building routinely that suspects something and fails to report it until you come back in on Monday or Tuesday or whatever the day is. And now you're going to have an F609 because you failed to report timely. So here's an example. This is an immediate jeopardy example, and this is from our region. And oh, by the way, F609 tagged in 47% of all surveys. So roughly 50% of all surveys in the past 12 months in our region have had an F609 failure to report timely of abuse or neglect tag. So this is an immediate jeopardy finding, and it is exactly the example that I just talked about. A staff member failed to report an incident involving a nurse. It was reported by a CNA, but the incident took 10 days to report to the survey agency and authorities. And when the surveyor inquired with the CNA why they failed to report, they reported the incident to the manager the day after the incident because the nurse in question, the nurse that they suspected of abuse or witnessed an incident with, was the actual abuse coordinator for the weekend shift, and they didn't know how to report above that individual. So I want you to think about that. So this is an example where they had a nurse manager, and it's a pretty heinous immediate jeopardy. This particular nurse was observed dragging a resident backwards down a carpeted hallway, and the staff didn't know what to do. The staff in the building talked to each other, but they didn't know who to contact because the nurse in question was the abuse coordinator for the weekend shift. It was a unit manager. And the facility received an immediate jeopardy for failure to report timely, along with another immediate jeopardy for abuse and neglect. So when you're providing education to your staff and when you're writing your policy and procedure and your processes, make sure you include how to report if it's somebody that you're working with or it's your supervisor. What do you do? Now, I want you to think about this because unfortunately, you have staff working in your building that are young, they're scared, they're frightened, maybe they're intimidated by their supervisor. Are they comfortable? Are they comfortable? Have you created a culture where reporting is encouraged and discussed? And is the feedback loop established for staff that bring a concern to you that you give them feedback on the outcome? You may not be able to tell them, and you shouldn't tell them, obviously, what happened to that particular employee that they reported on, but it's important that you close that loop with the employee to know that, hey, thank you for bringing this forward. We're going to do the investigation. Please continue to do, I thank you for bringing it forward, and encourage them to have that culture of conversation where it's a safe place that they can bring these things forward to you. Any questions or comments about this? Anything, Constance, that anybody has said in the chat?
I asked if anybody had a binder, and they said yes, there are cheat sheets located in the binder at the nurse station, which I, of course, said was very nice to remind people.
Yeah, it's important, I think, that your staff know and make sure that those binders are up to date. Again, monthly as part of your abuse copy audits, go and make sure that your phone numbers are up to date, that the administrator, DON contact, who to call. I will share with you, having worked in many buildings in the past, 15 to 20 years, apparently my phone number has been on a few, is still in a few binders, because up until about a year ago, I would still occasionally get a call in the middle of the night from a facility. And I'm like, oh gosh, they haven't updated their binder. So make sure you update the binders that, if you have a change in leadership, and we have transitions, and when you transition people in and out, and if you're a new administrator in your building, go and pull all those binders. You'll be surprised where some things are hiding. Make sure you look at every nurse's station, every office, to make sure that if you have an emergency binder that has been disseminated to people, that they're updated. Maybe make that a monthly, like a process improvement plan when you first start as an administrator. Have them bring them all to the to a meeting, a morning meeting, and make sure that everything in that binder, the contact information, the emails, the cell phone numbers, everything is accurate. It's probably the best task that you can do as a new administrator going into a building, or a new director of nursing, to make sure that your staff have the right contacts so that you can avoid an F609 tag because they're trying to call somebody that no longer works in the building. So when you're talking about doing an investigation, I want you to first rely on your abuse policy. So let's say a staff member comes to you and states, Mrs. Smith is stating that she's missing 2 pairs of blue pants, and they were in her closet yesterday, but she's not finding them today. Now, misappropriation? Maybe. Missing items? Maybe. Do you have to report that within, immediately? Do you suspect it's a crime? Right? So those are the things that you have to go through and think about when you're talking about an investigation. So you don't have a lot of time to get your investigation done. So outline your steps based on your policy. You need to start with interviews. And do you do an interview where you interview and write the statement, or is your policy state that the employee gives you a written statement that's signed and dated? Or do you do it both ways? Is it not even in your process to do one or the other? And if not, why? What is your corporate, if you're part of a corporate chain, what does your corporate risk management organization tell you to do? Often that's the first place to start, is who's your risk management, who handles the liability in your organization, and see what they prefer when it comes to doing investigations. Recreate the situation if applicable, and look for other potential victims and situations. It's important that we do those interviews, and we interview residents who are interview of like situation. If it's a potential abuse allegation, you're going to want to make sure that you expand that interview to anybody that particular person may have been in contact with, to see if there were any other concerns, and to make sure you have the scope of the issue confined or understood in your investigation. And then review the data. Is it isolated, pattern, or widespread? And I use those words purposefully because that helps define your risk or culpability when it comes to an F tag. Is it going to be a D, an E, an F? Is it, a high level tag? Do an ad hoc copy to review the data and develop an action plan. Did you do a root cause? Did you talk about what happened? And then write your action plan with delineated responsibilities by department and set follow-up meetings and reviews. And this is especially important if it's an actual allegation of abuse or misappropriation that you've reported to both the state agency and law enforcement where there is a suspicion of a crime. And again, involve your risk management, your liability company, any corporate people. Review your policy and procedure for notification. Who has to be notified? Follow-up steps for the residents. Make sure the resident is safe. Make sure their care plan has been updated. And then if it's applicable for residents, identify for psychological harm or changes. And who's going to monitor that resident or meet with that resident to assess for that? What's the education for staff going to look like? And then what audit? Are you going to do competency audits on process and policy gaps if they were identified for your staff? And then do a review of the event and data associated with the event. Do action plan reviews. Have they been completed? If we've missed a step, why did we miss a step? It's really important that you keep track, especially in a big investigation, that you keep track of this all in a written documented format. I know I'm a big proponent of past noncompliance. I know it's not something that's readily recognized by the state surveyors, but why I like past noncompliance is because it's a process improvement plan that you do related to an incident to help understand what happened, how it happened, and what you're going to do to prevent it from happening again. And it keeps it all in one. I always kept it in a binder and electronically so that I had the steps. If, for example, medication error that resulted in harm. All right, reportable to the state agency, reportable. We know that they're going to come in on it. We know that's going to be a pretty significant survey tag. I'm going to start that process right now, and I'm not going to wait for them to come in. I'm going to start the process, get the education, do all of the things that I need to do to assess how it happened, why it happened, and get it fixed before the surveyors come in on that particular issue. And why do we do that? Well, we want to stop harm from happening to other residents. We want to make sure that we're keeping our residents safe and, safe and harm-free. And, I think about past noncompliance, and I think people think, well, it's not going to be accepted. We just don't do it. I really encourage you to consider doing past noncompliance type risk management for any issue that you believe has occurred that you believe is going to be something that's surveyable, that it's going to be, that you've missed a step in one of the F tags, any F tag, it's important to do that with. But around abuse, neglect, and misappropriation, I think it's always good to run it through that process. Give an example of a phone call that I took this week. Medication found in a med cart that was popped, and it appeared to be a narcotic medication, but they couldn't identify, it was just a pill in the bottom of a med cart. Couldn't identify who it belonged to. Nobody reported that it was missing. There were no residents missing a medication. What do you do in that situation? Is it really misappropriation? Who do you call? How do you walk through that as a facility? With any incident that you have that's such a gray space, I encourage you to bring your team together, talk about it, walk through it with the key personnel, and identify the processes that you're going to do to either investigate, report, or create that so-called soft file on the incident in the event that it becomes something bigger or larger. So it brings us to, how do I know if it's reportable? Well, first and foremost, what does your policy state? And what does the F tag state? Secondly, if it's an allegation of abuse or neglect, is the resident stating psychological harm, or are they demonstrating changes based upon the incident? And then what are your past practices for this particular situation? And then finally, I would review this with your compliance team or officer or risk management organization. And if you are the administrator or director of nursing and you just have that feeling, I always, my philosophy has always been, when in doubt, report it out. I've held that philosophy and I've stuck firm to it because you know your building best. You're the leadership in the building, you know your residents, and you know your staff. And, I've taken, worked for a lot of different organizations, and I've stated to corporate people, like, listen, I really feel strongly that this is something we need to report and do an investigation on. You know, if we get an F tag, we get an F tag, but at least we've done our due diligence and we've understood the culpability around it. And I think so as an organization, as a group, as an administrator or director of nursing, if this is your first time, working in a long-term care environment, I'd really encourage you to put that hat on and to think about your responsibility as the leader in the building in making the right decision to keep residents and staff safe. So we're going to do some scenarios now. I'm going to run through some scenarios, and then I want you guys to please interact and just give me some feedback about what to do. So we have a resident, and this never happens, right? I can't tell you how many of these reports I've probably taken in my lifetime as an administrator. Resident reports to a night shift nurse during early med pass, the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., that the aide who cared for her at bedtime, right around 9 p.m., was rough with her and tossed her around like a rag doll. So the resident first reports to the night shift nurse who's doing early med pass, probably going in at 5 o'clock in the morning, doing, a Synthroid or some type of early AM medication. And the resident states, hey, Sally Sue, the aide who cared for me at bedtime, was rough and tossed me around like a rag doll. What should that nurse do first? What should the nurse do first that gets this from the resident? Here's this from the resident. Don't everybody talk at once. Assess resident for injury. Yes, absolutely. Assess the resident for injury first and foremost. Yep. Notify, assess the resident for injury, offer that resident assurance that you are going to be responsible to take care of her, correct? Provide that resident some confidence and assess and ask more questions. What specifically happened? What does tossed around like a rag doll mean? Take some notes. Train your nursing staff, your nurses, on how to take some basic interview questions. When they get that report, you're going to get them on the phone, and 9 times out of 10, they're going to be going back and forth to that resident with you as you're driving into work, asking those questions because you're starting that investigation upon that immediate phone call, aren't you? I mean, I don't know how many of you have had to come into work early, roll out of bed because you get that phone call at 6 o'clock in the morning that a resident's made an allegation, and you've got 2 hours to get that report if it's suspicion of a crime. So as you're talking to your staff driving into the building, what do you want them to ask that resident? You want to know, what specifically did she do? Has she ever worked with her before? Has this ever happened before? And you're going to want to know from the nurse who the particular aide was that was assigned to that set. What other residents were assigned to this particular aide? Because on night shift, right, sometimes staffing can be a little interesting, and you may have staff taking on different units, different compared to other shifts. And you're going to want to make sure that that person is no longer in the building working, that they haven't worked over. Because the first thing you want to do is make sure that that staff member is not in the building, right? You got to prevent the other residents. Get that person out of the building. Even if the allegation is unfounded, you have to remove the individual that is the, allegation has been made about from the building. Take the staff member off the schedule pending investigation, even if it's unsubstantiated. Yes, you need to put them off the schedule and explain to them why they're off the schedule. It's for their safety as well as the residents. So excellent. Good job on this one, guys. And again, so I just want you to roll these around in your head thinking about it. This one is a common one. Residents have perceptions of how care is provided. And I think it's important when we train our nursing assistants or our staff providing care that if they rush with residents, that the perception can be this, that they feel tossed around, they don't feel heard, they don't feel cared for in a loving manner. And the intent may not be abuse, but it is perceived to be less than kind. All right, scenario 2. Nurse notes upon assessment that the resident has a new bruised area. This is a skin assessment on their upper arm that consists of 4 small bruises on top and 1 large on the bottom that appear new, reddened, and visible. The resident demonstrates some discomfort at the area with guarding, but the resident's not a good reporter of information. DIMS of 3. What do you do in this situation? So you have a staff member. What do those bruises look like? Are those bruises of an unknown origin? Or do we think that we know what happened? Where do we start with this investigation? And is this reportable within 2 hours? So to answer the first part or the last part of that, more than likely, you're going to report this within 2 hours. More
Yes,
than
report.
likely. Pardon me? Yes,
That's what
report it.
yes,
Yes,
report.
report it. Again, you have those 5 days to do your investigation to determine whether or not you believe that this was a harm, an actual harm caused to the resident, or it was because of something that occurred. So report it out. I would report it and say, we're going to do our investigation. Now, during the investigation, let's say we discovered that this particular resident was laid on the floor the night before by staff because she was falling. And staff grabbed her, and there is a good incident report identifying that staff instinctively grabbed her to prevent her from falling to the floor and fracturing. And in that grabbing, they grabbed her arms. Okay. We've also discovered during our investigation that this particular resident is on medication that would cause her blood to thin. She's on either a Coumadin or a medication that would cause her to have thinner blood and bruise easily. Would we say that that's necessarily abuse? Probably not. We would say, we have a pretty good idea of how this happens. So it's probably not an injury of unknown origin. And we would conclude that on our 5-day, would we not? And we would probably do some x-rays of this resident's arm to make sure there wasn't a fracture. Everybody agree with that? I'm not a nurse, by the way. I'm a social worker by background. So when I play in the nursing sandbox, sometimes I get better feedback, and I appreciate this. All right. Next scenario. Oh, this one's a tough one. Day shift nurse on Monday morning is informed by the outgoing nurse that the count is off for patient's A narcotic medication in pill form. What should the day shift nurse do first? And this is like a 6:30 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. nurse to nurse med count. What do you do? Do you take the cart from the outgoing nurse with the count being off? Do you instruct your nurses? Constance, no, we don't take the cart. Report it for possible theft. Exactly. And that day shift nurse, let's say there's no leadership in the building. Night nurse cannot leave. That should be your policy. That night nurse has to have a sit down in the front lobby till the director of nursing, the administrator, somebody's got to come in and do that investigation pretty quickly, right? Now, here's where it's interesting. Let's say that we're informed and we discover that this particular count is off of patient A's narcotic medication pill form, and patient A is a private pay individual who pays for their medications on their own. Is that a misappropriation that we're reporting also? Yes, it is. This is an area that nursing homes often get hung up on. If you have missing medication, missing treatments, I've seen wound dressings that are expensive walk-out buildings that patients Medicare or Medicaid or privately have paid for. That is a misappropriation. And I don't think facilities understand or comprehend that when you have a misappropriation to that level, you need to report it. And it is reportable to the police, to your state surveyor agency, and you need to do an investigation. When it is discovered, it's a suspicion of a crime. So that 2-hour window starts ticking the immediacy that you're notified that that item is missing. That makes sense to everybody? It is a suspicion of a crime, and you should be notifying your authorities on that. Okay. Any questions about the scenarios that anybody has, or anybody have a scenario that they would like to talk about or bring up when we talk about abuse or neglect reporting, or struggles that you're having with getting staff to do reportables? So I would share with you, this is such a gray space for staff. The thing that I cannot extend, what to do if your law enforcement says, why are you calling me? Well, you tell them that you have a missing medication, right, Patricia, right, Patty? You tell them that you have a medication that you suspect someone has stolen. Then you need to use some keywords. You need to say, we suspect a crime has occurred. We have medications that are missing. And you ask them for at least a report of the phone call if they refuse to come out. You ask them to give you a report number and say, listen, if you're not going to come out on missing narcotic medication, can I at least get a copy of this phone conversation or a report number, because I'm going to need that for my state survey report. So that happens. It happens frequently. It's
Absolutely,
unfortunate.
report number,
Miss-
you're gonna want that.
And
Yes.
Miss
State
Jan-
surveyors are going to ask, yep.
Miss Jana, just to go back to some conversations around talking to your executive team or your corporate team about those investigations through your risk management process and so forth. Have you encountered in your 30 years of being able to work with your surveyors or your state survey managers specifically, not every state survey manager is going to be accessible, but have you had that where, especially when you have a resident that repeatedly has allegations
Yes.
that tend to be unfounded?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to work with that, right? So one, state survey agencies, your state survey directors, your team leads, whatever they're called in your state, they see your frequent flyers, especially if you're reporting, 5, 6, 7, 8 incidents in a 12-month period or a 4-month period, even on resident to resident verbal altercations or residents making allegations of misappropriation. An example of that I can share, and this is not a Michigan example. It's not one of our state examples, but resident would repeatedly come into the office of the executive director stating that their cigarettes were stolen. It's a smoking facility in an inner city area, urban area, and the report would be made and the cigarettes would be replaced. Well, the resident understood that this was a way to get free cigarettes because they had expended their money on cigarettes. So we took the executive director, I sat with my social worker and we're like, okay, we involved the state survey team. And we're like, listen, we have this suspicion that this is what we believe is going on. And we are now buying, $20 worth of cigarettes a month for this person because they're using all their money and then they claim that things are being stolen. So we set up a lockbox for the particular resident that was kept in their room with a key for them to use. And then the next thing you know, of course, the lockbox key is missing and the cigarettes are gone again. So long story short, it's time consuming. It's a lot of communication. It's involving the ombudsman. It's involving the social worker, potentially psychiatric services if you've got them involved with this particular resident. Those pieces were there and their guardian. And we set up a situation where we kept the cigarettes literally at the nurse's station for all the residents in a lockbox that the nurse who was in charge of the narcotic key had to keep. Was that the ideal situation? Not really, because it was an extra step that my nurses had to do, and it really wasn't necessarily their job. However, when we talked about it as a team and we talked about it with the nurses, they preferred that over the constant complaints that somebody was stealing something from them. And it eliminated that situation because we could keep track of literally how many cigarettes they had smoked in a 24-hour period. It got to be that's how particular we had to do. So, I would involve your IDT team. I would do a good discussion. I'd involve possibly, an ombudsman if you've got an ombudsman that works well with your building, a patient advocate if they've got a patient advocate, their family, a guardian. But I think, Makisha, that's what you're asking about, right? Those residents that have those frequent allegations or concerns that come forward.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And that is unfortunately, something that we know happens over and over and over again. And it's really sad because residents do get a very limited amount of money. And if smoking is the one thing that brings them pleasure and they're limited because of the cost prohibition of the cigarettes, it's a lot of one-on-one time with that particular resident to find other opportunities for them to not be feeling like they needed to smoke all the time is the only thing that they weren't involved in. My concern as the executive director was activities. Are they getting enough activities to keep them busy outside of smoking? Because that seemed to be the thing they were focused on the most. So it can lead to other areas that you discover when you start to do your investigation. Any other questions that anybody has or comments? Any scenarios? I know this is a very big topic. It's a very broad topic. I think if there's only one takeaway that you take away from today, it's go back to your buildings, go into your buildings, go check your education, check your staff competency around this topic, and make sure your policies and procedures are up to date and that you've really put some meat around your education. Make sure that education isn't just the same education that you used year over year, in electronic format. Change it up, make it scenario based. And when I talk about scenario-based education, I just want to give you a little idea of what that looks like. So when I interview staff and when I would work directly one-on-one with staff and do audits, I would often just pull them aside. I always have candy in my pocket. I try to make it non-threatening. And I would say, and I'm going to use you, Makisha. I would say, hi, Makisha, can you give me a few minutes? I got a question for you. I'm out here doing audits this month. And, if you give me an answer that doesn't quite meet what I'm looking for, it's okay. You're not in trouble. This is just me seeing how well we're doing on our education program. So, Keisha, I'm going to run a scenario by you. Let's say Mary Sue tells you that the aide that you came in behind was mean to her last night. What should you do first? And kind of walk you through, Makisha, you're the scene. I'd walk you through that scenario, and then I would ask additional questions based on your response. And try to see if they, in that scenario, how would they respond in the immediacy of that? And I would have them give it to me in their words. And what you're doing when you do a scenario-based interview is you're having them pull information from a different part of the brain that they don't necessarily get from just watching it on a monitor, hearing it, or reading it. They're actually having to think about how to apply that knowledge. And I think that's really telling when it comes to gauging staff's comprehension and competency around abuse and neglect. So if you ever have and you want a need for a scenario or you have a question, I would just encourage you to go out to 2567s, go out to S&Q Corps, go out to your state survey or your state websites and pull some surveys and look at those 2567 examples and use those for your own facility staff for some of that interactive education opportunity. I think we learn best when we read it from somebody else to see what they've experienced.
And then I do have a question about
Sure.
guardians and residents. So especially when it comes to treatments, including immunizations, if a guardian is saying, no, they don't want a resident to have a immunization, whether it's COVID-19, influenza, or whatever, and the resident says they do want it, how do you navigate that? And when do you feel, because I have had staff be like, well, I feel like that person is just being controlling or abusive towards that resident because of, withholding treatment. So how do we handle those scenarios, especially when it comes to a resident right versus the guardian being making that decision?
So there's a couple avenues. One, you could absolutely involve your ombudsman because they are supposed to be responsible as patient advocates and ask the patient, ask them to be involved and interview that resident and kind of get that disinterested third party involved in the situation. I'll give you an example of that, Keisha. Many years ago, I had a guardian that was a family friend of a resident that decided that the medications were too expensive for this particular resident and he wanted to remove from all the medications and that he felt as the guardian, he had the right to make that choice. We as a facility knew that this resident needed particular medications to maintain her quality of life and quality of health and that she would decline rapidly without those medications. We also knew that it's not necessarily appropriate. It could be construed as abuse or neglect by withholding medications. So we involved immediately the ombudsman, and we actually went and filed for a temporary guardian ad litem for that particular resident to make decisions on behalf of the resident and to take it in front of the judge or the court advocate to have the conversation about what the intent was. If the guardian was not going to be bending with us, and this particular guardian was not going to listen to anything that we had to say, and it was going to be, that was his answer, and there was no discussing it. So you have avenues. Guardianships can be, they're great things because they are acting in, they're supposed to be acting in the best interest of the resident. However, as the facility, it is your obligation to prevent a resident from abuse and neglect. And if you feel a guardian is going to put a resident in a situation that could be construed as abuse and neglect, or even misappropriation of their items, which does happen with guardians, you have the right and yet the obligation to report it. Adult Protective Services, your ombudsman, the court, you can go many avenues. So I
Thank
hope that
you.
answered it.
Yes, thank you.
Yep. Thank you. Is there any other questions? I have on this page the resources. These are some just different resources that found out online, and the SOM obviously is one. If you are a leading age member, they have this great PDF on F609. Here is an action plan template for completing an action plan. And then here's our frontline forces on resident well-being. So thank you.
I'm not seeing any questions, but I just want to remind you, if before the end of the call, we encourage you to consider signing up for a mobile vaccination clinic and completing the Vivint Health interactive education modules that will go over information on RSV, pneumonia, and COVID-19. They're available free to use for you, your family, or your residents. Residents, families, and the staff members at your facility, as well as you guys. But we encourage you guys to use those. They're only available for a limited time. So we've placed those in the chat, the links for those as well. One last thing, or two last things actually. We want to thank you, Jana, so much for presenting on this. This is so important. We also are inquiring about any topics of education modules or frontline forces modules that you might be in need of in your facilities. We just want to know what you're looking for or what you're in need of, so you can put that in the chat, as well as reminding you that we do have our frontline forces, which she actually put the link in the chat, as well as it is on the PDF that Jana just posted. So those are modules that you can use to educate all of your staff. They're geared more towards frontline staff, any frontline staff, but can be used in nursing homes as well. I know that Jana wanted to talk about a program that they have coming up soon, and then I'll give you some information about one other program we have, and then the next phone call that we'll have.
Yep. Thank you, Constance. Real quick, I just want to give a plug to those of you in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Those of us working on the Targeted Response QII Infection Control Team are going to be taking our show on the road August 20th in Minnesota and August 22nd in Wisconsin. We will be doing in-person events on those 2 days. It is a free in-person infection prevention training for your IPs or staff acting as the infection preventionist in your building. It's an opportunity for them to gain some new knowledge, peer-to-peer relationships, and really to help build that core competency around all things infection control in your buildings. Our goal is to really help decrease the turnover of infection preventionists in nursing homes, which we see as a continued trend, unfortunately. So thank you.
Also, if you're in need of assistance with getting education out to your staff, we do have the annual IPC compliance education where our IPC, from Wisconsin, we have 3 different people that are on our team that will come out to your facility and provide education, or you can do online education and we'll validate competency, as well as we have we're building a escape room, an online version, as well as a in-person version. So you can have education tailored to your needs. So I do have a link for that. You can reach out to anybody on the team here. Anybody from Superior Health would be able to get you to the right people for that link. It's also on our website. Before we conclude, I want to remind you that we have the evaluation that has been dropped into the chat. Please take a second to fill that out. Our next presentation will be on Wednesday, July 24th, same time, same place, where we'll continue our series on turning deficiencies into efficiencies, and insightful session on F0761, labeling and storage of drugs and biologics, with Ms. Lisa Schock, an industry expert. We'll delve into the critical aspects of accurate labeling and secure storage. You can learn how to comply with current and acceptable professional principles, including labeling the medications with appropriate instructions, precautions, and expiration dates. We'll discover the best practices for storing these drugs and biologics, and ensuring proper temperature controls and limiting access to only authorized persons. before you leave today, please click on the evaluation. Thank you. We can't wait to see you on July 24th. Bye.